Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode, we're going to talk about a little-known event in the history of Europe, and that is the 1918 revolution inside of Germany.
Yes, so this is sort of a little bit different topic, not as well known. The revolution sort of started in 1918. It really more of the important events happened in 1919, but it sort of comes in the context of the sort of chaos of post-World War I Germany. You can sort of see why these sort of groups like the Nazis arose comes from this chaos that's happening in 1918 and 1919. And a lot of things happened that were important in the German political scene in the 20s and 30s that we don't really remember very well now, especially in the US, but were very important and are sort of part of what was happening in Germany at this time.
Because a lot of people, they don't realize this, but after World War I, Germany was not occupied for the most part.
Well, no, the Rhineland and like the Saarland were occupied, but the vast majority of Germany was not under occupation. In fact, the Germans controlled a lot of territory in the east, in Russia and such, as of 1918, and they sort of withdrew after the armistice. I mean, obviously, the Versailles Treaty that's going to hand away a lot of the territory hasn't happened yet.
Right. But events were extremely chaotic. Mm-hmm. A lot of people were displaced. Yeah. A lot of veterans of the war were just had nothing to do all of a sudden.
Yeah, and a lot of people sort of had this confusion about why Germany surrendered. And this sort of the stab in the back thing comes from the fact that a lot of people... It wasn't a stab in the back, just to clarify, but
right.
just to, but the point is that a lot of people in Germany wondered, well, the war barely was fought on German soil. I mean, there was a little bit of fighting in the West and some fighting early in the East in German territory, but it was mainly fought in other countries. So some Germans sort of wondered, why did we lose? I mean, there were very good reasons for why Germany lost World War I, if you think about it rationally. But at the time, it's appeared to some people we were militarily winning. Mm-hmm. And so this chaos, you've got all these people who are confused. Remember, the Kaiser stepped down, I think it was 2 days before November 11th. So on November 9th, the Kaiser steps down. There's revolts in the Navy. And there's sort of chaos all over the place. There's an armistice. And this chaos sort of carries over into the post-war period. You have all sorts of crazy things going on. Remember, the Red Revolution and the Russian Revolution was only a year before.
Right.
So you've got communists running around. There was actually an uprising in Berlin, the Spartacists.
Yeah.
That was led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Have you ever heard of Luxemburgist communists or Marxists? How this unique interest, this sort of view on this bizarre kind of strange view on communism. They were put down, actually. And that comes in as part of what was something called the Freikorps, which is a lot of people don't really remember about the Freikorps, but the Freikorps were basically these bands of sort of right-wing German veterans who sort of banded together to fight against these left-wing groups and against more than just these communists revolting, but against social democrats and the Weimar Republic as a whole.
Yeah. Basically mercenaries.
Yeah, they were in a sense. Some of them would probably have considered themselves some sort of patriots. So they thought maybe they were saving Germany. There's actually a whole detachment of them who fought against the Russians in the Baltic states, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I think primarily Estonia and Latvia. They were called the Iron Brigade, the Iron Division. They were actually made up of Baltic Germans. And then you had Germans inside of Germany proper, what we think of now. And they were the ones who killed Liebknecht in Luxembourg. And they put down these general revolutions. There's actually a Bavarian Soviet Republic.
That's right. It's easy to forget, after the Russian Revolution, is that a lot of people expected the global communist revolution to start, that there would be Soviet republics all over the place, springing up independently of each other. And this is just an odd example of...
Yeah, it is. And because people forget the sort of chaos with the flu pandemic at the time, chaos of... people forget about that killed more people probably than World War I.
The Spanish influenza is unbelievable how little it's talked about. It killed a ridiculous amount of people all across the planet.
Yeah. Including many people who just lived through 4 years of World War I.
Right. And the idea that people don't really mention it very much, mention the social... ramifications of it is just nuts. It's totally crazy. And a big part of that is the fact that during the war, there were all these governments that were focused on the war effort. So they didn't want to talk about there's this giant pandemic killing everybody. We have to keep that quiet so there's not widespread panic. Yeah. The reason it's called Spanish influenza itself it didn't start in Spain. It started in the Midwest of the United States, actually. It's just that Spain, because it was a neutral country, was one of the few countries that had a free press that could talk about how awful this pandemic was. And it just became, by association, like, oh, this is the Spanish flu.
Yeah. And so, and I guess so we're just sort of underscoring the sort of confusion that's going on. The Bavarian Soviet Republic, I guess I should have clarified quickly, in the first half of 1919, there basically was like a red revolution in Munich. A Soviet republic, a communist country, was declared as part of Bavaria. Bavaria was declared as part of this communist country. It was put down by the Freikorps, put it down. But it was very, very traumatizing for a lot of people in Germany because they thought, oh my goodness, like the Red Revolution has arrived in Germany. And actually was very developmental, I think, if I recall reading somewhere about Hitler was very much impacted by this. The fact that the leader of this, or at least one of the leaders of this, was a Hungarian Jew. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of sort of inflamed anti-Semitic sort of feelings and anti-communist feelings. And, I think when you read in history books, you say like, oh, people were terrified of the Bolsheviks. And why were they terrified in Germany? Well, because we forget nowadays there had been serious uprisings by communist forces.
Yeah. Taking territory, occupying areas.
Yeah.
Like that's
it's really interesting. So we're spending a lot of time going into the background on this, but just to understand, ultimately these were put down. The Versailles Treaty was signed. The Weimar Republic comes into existence. But the point is that there's a lot of chaos going on, and that people sort of forget about this. They think about the post-war chaos with the money. The famous stories about people taking wheelbarrows of money to buy when there's hyperinflation in 1923, I think. But they forget about this happening in the immediate aftermath of the war. That there's significant fighting and such. So we wanted to discuss sort of some alternate scenarios we think that could have arisen out of that.
So I think the first one being like the very obvious one is like victory. How could this have actually succeeded? And what would the ramifications of seeing all these red states appear and continue to exist inside of Germany?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, to be perfectly frank. I don't see the real way that these could have succeeded, given they were maybe if they were more organized in a more unified fashion. But the truth is that the Spartacists were doing their own thing in Berlin. What's going on in Bavaria is completely separate from that. So I don't know if that could really succeed. But let's say it does succeed. I mean, maybe you would have had I don't know if there could have been a stable Bavarian Soviet Republic. I feel like the remainder of Germany probably would have focused on doing what it did in reality, was crushing it. But let's say they do succeed. Somehow there's a unified effort, and Germany does fall into the control of communists. I mean, I feel like a lot of people are going to fight back very hard, the Freikorps, and a lot of maybe more moderate or right-leaning people, or even moderate people.
Yeah, even moderate people are kind of horrified by the idea of becoming part of a communist country.
State. And I don't even know if the people who are leading these communist revolutions really would have the ability to run the country, even if they have it under control, and they somehow manage to suppress the assured uprisings and violence that would arise out of it.
Right.
But let's just say we give them the win, just for purposes. Yeah.
So, all right, what's their relation with the Soviet Union going to be? Because obviously the Soviet Union's going to want to be kind of in charge of this. Yeah. Like, are they becoming a client state? Are they going to become their own separate form of communism, and they'll be in conflict with them?
Well, it's hard to project, because if you think about it, remember the Russian Civil War doesn't really end until 1921. So let's say this revolution succeeds in 1919. Basically, yes, or the first Red Revolution would have been in Russia, but it would have been pretty much Germany and Russia are equals on that. I feel like Russia with more resources would take the lead, or maybe Germany would, considering, remember that all the predictions from Orthodox Marxists before Lenin had been that the revolution, when it comes, is going to start in Germany because it's the largest and most industrialized nation, key focus on the industrialized nation in all of Europe. So let's say you have a communist Germany, and it somehow manages to put itself together. We're also forgetting the fact that, remember, people forget about this, the Allies, the United States, Britain, and France, and Japan intervened militarily in the Russian Civil War. There weren't many, but there were American troops in Vladivostok until I think 1920. There was the Polar Bear Expedition, as it was sometimes called, French, British, and American troops in Arkhangelsk, up in far northern Russia. There's British and French troops in the Caucasus or the Ukraine, if I recall. I mean, so there's significant involvement. And I can only imagine that involvement would be even heavier if Germany is under
absolutely
control.
Conflicts with Poland.
Yeah, obviously.
Poland's stuck in the middle between the two.
The Polish government in the interwar years was actually quite conservative. It was a military government actually by the late 30s, I think by mid to late 30s. But the point is that I wonder are Britain and France going to feel like we can't tolerate a communist state in the middle of Europe and maybe invade on a larger scale? Do the But do the British and French after World War One have the appetite to expend the amount of blood and materiel that's going to be required for that?
Right.
Are we going to see another war breaking out in Europe in the 20s?
It's like a question of like, okay, let's say Germany's controlled by communists. Are they still a threat to Britain and France? And I think the answer is maybe yeah.
Well, I think the British and French are going to see them as a threat regardless if they're an actual threat. I feel like the consolidation of a communist revolution in Germany would be pretty bloody and really take the wind out of their sort of desire to become like internationalists and expand.
Right.
Be surrounded by enemies on all sides.
And to expand on the point of being internationalist and expanding, does this mean that there's a metastasizing of communism inside of Europe?
Well, yeah, you wonder if it would embolden with two successful revolutions in two very large European countries that further emboldens communism, in other places. Would you see a heavier crackdown early on left-wing parties or such like that, sort of communists being outrightly banned? Is it going to invigorate, as I sort of, this sort of invigorate maybe the Trotskyist approach? Because remember, Stalin took the sort of, one country communism approach, sort of like, let's solidify communism here before we try to expand. And really, it's not until after World War II that they really do that, unless you're like Mongolia or a country right on Russia's borders. But, with a Germany in communist hands, are people going to say, well, we've got to expand quickly, the sort of Trotsky approach that, communism, it's all about a quick expansion. Sort of thing.
Or even possibly we could see Germany balkanizing, like parts of Germany just saying, absolutely not, I'm not going to be part of this, a civil war breaking out. And I mean, at this point, Germany hadn't been united for really all that long. I mean, you could definitely...
1870s.
Yeah, I mean, you could see it just falling back apart into these little...
Roughly 50 years, later, 50 years of existence. Possibly. I could certainly see parts maybe seceding away, or the British or the French taking like the Rhineland and just not giving it up. So sort of a rump German state. Maybe Poland snatching up some more territory, around Gdansk.
Gdansk, yeah.
Gdansk, or however they say, but, Danzig at the time, maybe just sort of chopping away more at Germany's eastern borders, being like, well, they're kind of distracted right now. So yeah, you have. I think this would radically change the interwar period. Absolutely, of course, no Nazi Germany or whatever. It changes the calculus, and I think we sort of put down sort of the notes as sort of like, do we have like a World War II sort of breaking out later on, where it's like a Russia-Germany alliance versus the rest of Europe? Right. Is that going to shift sort of the what we think of the Axis allies thing is sort of just completely different?
Well, in a very bizarre and almost, I would say, perverse relationship, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia did cooperate on a lot of different things in the real world, like splitting up Poland.
Tank development, actually, a lot of German tank development in between the wars was done in Russia because they were under strict supervision from the Versailles Treaty.
Yeah, there was a lot of training which occurred inside of Russia. Russia gave Nazi Germany lots of supplies and materials, like train loads full of coal and molybdenum and all sorts of crap, sent just days before the actual invasion of Russia occurred.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that just changes the whole calculus. I think something like this is just one of those radical changes where, I feel like European countries are going to be much more focused on because basically in the interwar period until a few years before 1939, a lot of countries sort of really, they shrank their armies and it became much more interested in economic issues. Military issues just sort of faded from the forefront. And I wonder, in a world like this, you feel like a lot of people may be like, well, we've got a communist Germany, a communist Russia, they're working together. Maybe we can't really go so far back on our military development.
Yeah.
So maybe a France and Britain that's much more militarized than they were in reality, simply because there's this threat of a communist state plop down, not on the fringes of Europe. And I think that's why some people could get away with sort of ignoring the USSR as they're sort of like, well, they're on the fringe.
Right.
Like Germany's plop in the center of Europe, the crossroads of Europe. It's just such a radical change. I don't know if it could even have sustained itself as a state.
No, probably not. I mean, there's so many people that would be so just absolutely against that sort of thing. And, we mentioned the Freikorps earlier. There's all these recent World War I veterans just sitting around, nothing to do, and just jumping at the opportunity to fight for the future of their country as they saw it.
No, absolutely. I think you have a lot of
opposition.
I just don't think it's very viable in the first place. But sort of positing a change like this really just changes the entire interwar dynamic. If there's even an interwar period, is there really it would be a fascinating change. Obviously, people opposed to communism in the interwar period, but I think in other countries like in the US and England, I think it would energize that anti-communist feeling even more so and earlier than it was in reality. Because, Germany, it's like, Russia could sort of be seen as far away, but Germany can't. Germany is, right at the center of Europe.
Also on just a purely speculative level, like what it would actually look like to have a communist revolution inside of an already industrialized nation with a pre-existing industrial base instead of just making one out of thin air, like with Russia.
Well, they could develop faster probably, although, the same, planned economies and such, the same inefficiencies. Who knows what sort of approach, what sort of communism is it going to be? Because remember, Marxist-Leninism, the type of communism that took hold in Russia, is a distinct form of communism that didn't become well known outside of the USSR until well after the Russian Revolution. So the communists that you had running around Germany, like Rosa Luxemburg, they're communists, but they're not, or they're more like Marxists. They're not communists in the way that we think of like the USSR. Like, there's a distinct subset, and even today there's still different branches of Marxism and stuff like that. Yeah. So this sort of Marxist state you may see in a Germany like this is just, I think, going to be radically different than the Soviet-style communism that we associate communism with.
Yeah, and I think as a result of that, you have to kind of think that there's probably going to be a lot of conflict between these two communist states because they're just so different in terms of demographically, they're different, their background is different, they're historical enemies of one another in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I could definitely see them just jockeying for like a Sino-Soviet split, like these two people who are kind of connected ideologically, but they're not really friends.
Yeah, absolutely. But the question is, would the world pay more attention to the German communism rather than the Soviet-style communism?
Yeah, like the Soviet-style communism was like this weird experiment, which was a prelude to the real communism.
Yeah, it would be interesting. Maybe they wouldn't be so united in their sort of push. And I guess that's because if you look at like the Eastern Bloc countries in World War II, it's because these communist puppet states put in place by Stalin in the USSR. So, of course they're going to follow the Soviet-style communism, but some sort of a... Because we think about, the only good example I can think of an independent communist state sprouting up without significant support from the USSR is actually Yugoslavia.
Yeah, Tito.
I mean, the Titoist communism, which is radically different. It was communist, but radically different from Soviet style. So maybe is Germany more of like a Titoist in that sense, like sort of communist, but not in the way that we imagine it. It's just, it is communism, but it's not in the way that we think of it in American culture, especially.
Yeah.
That it's just significantly different. Yeah. I think this is... I would put this on the list of far-fetched scenarios simply because I just don't think there's the manpower to be able to overthrow a German national government and create a communist state and sustain it. Even if you could take control, I feel like there would be enough popular sentiment to overthrow it.
Do you know of any works of alternate history that are at least a little bit similar to this sort of situation?
I'm glad you asked. There's actually, I remember, God, that was long ago. I wish I could remember. It was a story in an anthology, but it was all about Hitler coming to the United States, and the impetus for that is there's a communist revolution that takes over in Germany. So like a lot of the right wing in Germany goes to the United States. God, I think I read it like once and it was in the library or something like that. It was this has to be 5+ years ago. But I remember thinking to myself, that's a bizarre divergence. And it's because it's a pretty unique reference because to be perfectly frank, in the US, people just do not.
Nobody knows about this in the United States.
Especially popular culture. I mean, obviously people in the history community probably a little bit, but I think it's ignored. And people think like, oh, what happened? It was like Armistice, November 11, 1918, and then Versailles Treaty, 1919. Like there was a lot going on in between then.
Yeah.
And people forget about that.
Wasn't there a war between Poland and the Soviet Union during the interwar years as well?
Yes, in the early 1920s, the Polish-Soviet War. There's a Polish-Lithuanian War and a Polish-Ukrainian War.
That's nuts.
The wars of consolidation on Poland's eastern frontier. Because remember, what Poland got was basically this chunk of what was Germany, what include Warsaw was this big chunk out of Eastern Germany. But if you look at maps of Poland in pre-World War II, it's like sort of very narrow, and then it gets massively wide and takes up all this territory out in the east. And what happened is that originally Poland only got this one chunk that was Galicia from Austria-Hungary, and then these chunks from Germany. What happened is that basically Joseph Pilsudski, who is sort of one of the founders of the Polish state, And a lot of Polish forces actually moved into what would now be considered parts of Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania, and they actually just occupied it. And there was these wars that fought against the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, and the Soviets actually invaded and made it almost to Warsaw, to the banks of the Vistula. Wow. There was this sort of last stand by the Poles, the Battle of Warsaw, where they repulsed the Soviets in this huge victory. They sort of pushed them back, and they occupied a lot of territory. So like Vilnius, which is considered the traditional capital of Lithuania, was actually part of Poland in the interwar years and would be known as Vilno, W-I-L-N-O. And so like much of what's now Western Belarus was part of Poland. Brest-Litovsk, which was in the old Russian Empire, was part of Poland during the interwar period and then goes back to the Russians, and it's now in Belarus today, and then parts of far western Ukraine, so like the pro-EU parts of the Ukraine now, some of those very far western parts actually were part of Poland. And they had Ukrainian speakers. So like if you went out to Western, there's actually, I once saw a great map. There's an ethno-linguistic map of Poland in the interwar years. And it's very solidly Polish in the West and parts of the East. And then you get parts that are, everyone speaks Ukrainian, Lithuanian, or Russian.
Yeah, why is this even part of Poland?
Actually, there was actually resistance, and there was actually I think there was some guerrilla resistance at points from like the Ukrainians at least. So yeah, there was the number of ethnic issues that popped up with the creation of new nations in Eastern Europe was just crazy.
Yeah. A lot of people don't remember this, but after World War I and also World War II, there's gigantic movements of individuals across borders. Baltic Germans, for instance, there's like none left nowadays.
I don't think there's any left. I can think of those who hadn't fled after World War I, which a lot of them did, were sort of forcibly kicked out by the Soviets. I mean, there was a massive movement, because remember what's now Poland, if you look at it today, it was that chunk of Poland that they got from Austria, Hungary, and Germany in World War I, and then they took a big chunk of Eastern Prussia and Silesia, to parts of Eastern Germany that were handed over. That created the modern Polish state, and all that eastern part we were talking about earlier got ceded into the Soviet Union, and the Poles who were still left in that eastern part, which had just been ravaged by World War II, were forcibly kicked out and sent to the new areas in Western Poland, and the Germans who were in areas of Western Poland got forcibly removed to East Germany. There are people today living in Germany who were born in what's well into what's now Poland, or Polish people who were born in what's now Belarus or the Ukraine, stuff like that. So you see like very eastern part of Slovakia was absorbed into Russia. So there was massive movements of people. So traditional ethnic boundaries were actually much different. And like there used to be a very significant population of Germans in Romania too.
Yeah.
Transylvanian Saxons.
Huh.
And they were pretty much pushed out of Romania in the post-war years. Same thing with pockets of Hungarian speakers all over the place. I mean, it's really interesting. These displaced people just sort of sent all over the place.
Well, you're talking about like these conflicts of where are these borders actually drawn, and you know what should actually belong to us because our speakers are here, their speakers are here. You'd see a lot of that in like a communist Germany as well, because the border between Germany and Poland is also similarly a little fuzzy.
Absolutely.
In a lot of ways too.
Yeah, so you never know. I mean, a communist Germany is just sort of, in the interwar years, is just it's an interesting possibility. Really would just change the whole dynamic of what's going on in Europe. Sort of put the communist threat at the forefront. And it may embolden right-wing parties in a lot of places. Sort of, my God, they're, Germany, communist, right on the border.
As it did in real life.
Yeah, but I think it would just give that an extra, sort of nitro boost in a way, like way early, much earlier than it did, and would probably much more general acceptance and much more general fear than it did in reality.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
I think that's about it we have for this topic. Obviously, there's not we have some stuff to talk about. It's a, sort of more free form episode, but thank you for listening. This is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day.